Manticore by Darren Guthrie. Staff Sergeant Gabriel Shaw leads the men of 7th Squad, 4th Force Recon Marines, in a mission to apprehend an international arms dealer known only as Panther. A simple assignment that quickly turns into something far more deadly, as Shaw and his men uncover a plot to cause untold damage to the United States and the world economy. With no time, no backup, and a well-equipped army against them, 7th Squad races across the frozen Alaskan wastes to stop the attack, putting their own lives on the line to save countless others. Manticore is available on Amazon now. Follow the link in the description to read more. Prologue, 14th September, Baladogle Airfield, Somalia. My name is James Redman, and I'm a journalist. This is our 15th day in captivity. It was the voice of a man, low-pitched and distressed, floating over a continuous static noise, like a low-quality recording from 60 years ago. But it was a video recording from the day before, as Staff Sergeant Gabriel Shaw reclined in his seat, backed by the pitch-black room. The blue light of his computer screen glared brightly at his face, serving as the only source of light in the expanse of dim space. That was the 6th time Gabriel Shaw played the video. Physically, we are unharmed. The camera panned to the second man, who looked just as distressed as the first. He had short black hair and a pair of lost, hollow eyes, staring blankly away from the camera. But mentally, we are under great duress as we are being threatened by armed and dangerous men. The camera adjusted, panning wide, covering 3 turbaned men, clad in military uniforms, standing behind their hostages, clutching what appeared to Shaw to be old-model AK-47 rifles. And we are appealing to our loved ones and the government of the United States to please recommence dialogue with our kidnappers and meet their demands. They are losing patience, and they could kill us any moment from now if there is no response from anyone. The man's words trailed off into nothingness, and his eyes darted to the side nervously. A turbaned, masked figure appeared beside him, and the camera shook in terror as the unknown stranger bellowed something incomprehensible in Arabic. James Redman nudged the second man, who looked zoned out of his situation. "Your turn! Your turn!" a man with a heavy Arabic accent yelled in the background. The second hostage raised his eyes and stared at the camera. I have nothing to say. His eyes shrouded by a hood of darkness, devoid of emotion. All hope had sapped from his being, leaving him incapable of weeping, struggling, or even feeling. The video cut to an abrupt end. September 17th, Hiran Bakol region, Somalia. The pale crimson of the late afternoon desert sun blazed down on Shaw as he held his fist up to halt the encroaching Marines behind him. He looked at the small metallic disc that hung from his chest and nodded in satisfaction. They had been traversing the craggy mountain range since they had snuck out of their landing craft several hours earlier. The team stopped a few feet below him with no verbal communication and went prone. Their camo face paint blended with the environment better than he'd expected, and they made good progress while staying undetected. He returned his attention to scanning the small village below. He was leading a special recon team of 8 men to locate local rebels who had taken refuge in a small settlement hidden away in this mountain range. "We're here," he whispered, as if the village of small cement and mud houses could hear him as he spoke. There were a handful of small houses scattered on the plains, some with crumbled walls, half standing like a ghost town that had seen more than one battle. Staff Sergeant Eric Cruz inched closer and handed Shaw a pair of binoculars. Shaw took the binoculars without taking his eyes away from the small village down the cliff. Placing the pair of field glasses to his eyes, Shaw scanned the massive landscape, lowering his eyes towards the small, isolated village several miles away from where they stood. He saw a slender Somalian man, wearing a tan military camouflage jacket, with a pair of shorts that did not match his gear. He leaned against a wall, smoking a cigarette. Shaw shook his head as he spanned further, shifting away from the lone militant. There was a group of turbaned soldiers, playing cards games, sitting on chopped-off logs of wood the size of a small stool, their rifles leaning against the wall or lying in the dust. He spanned further away from the soldiers, shifting from building to building, scanning the terrain. It was a small Al-Shabaab terrorist camp. "How many men do you reckon are there?" Cruz asked as he lay right beside Shaw, who still had the field glasses to his eyes. "Report said only 15, Corporal Ryan Miller said, moving closer to the edge of the cliff as he spoke. 24, Shaw said. "I've counted 24 men now, not accounting for unseen potentials inside." He removed the binoculars from his eyes and stowed them in his combat webbing. Shaw glanced at his watch. It was some minutes past 4, and the sun was still blazing hot up above. He scurried farther back from the ledge, then gestured to his men to gather around. He pulled out a small map from a pocket and spread it on the ground, weighing it down with rocks. "Here," Gabriel Shaw gestured to his men as all 7 men inched closer to him. "When we get down there, treat these men like highly trained enemies, not some regular bandits. Strict fire control. It's unknown where the hostages are being kept. We move at exactly 8 p.m., first dark. We hit them hard, and we hit them fast. Cruz, you go left with Coleman and King." Shaw turned away from Cruz and gestured with his 2 fingers to the rest of the men, kneeling with their Special Operations Peculiar Modification, SOP mod, M4A1 rifles held tightly to their chests, waiting for his orders. "Anderson, you come with me. Harris and Martin, you flank to the right. Watch your steps." "What about me, boss?" Sergeant Santino Perez asked, shifting his weight from knee to better balance the weight of the much larger M110 semi-automatic precision rifle. Shaw turned to him. "What do you think of here?" he asked. Perez looked around, making mental notes Shaw could only guess at. "No. There," he said simply, pointing to an area roughly 50 meters along the ridgeline. Sergeant Perez was pushing 40 years of age and had been a Marine marksman for the better part of 2 decades. He should have been promoted several times by now, but that would have taken him away from the field and his beloved long-range rifles. If Perez said that was a better sniping nest, Shaw needed no more explanation, so he simply nodded his head. "All right, we fall back. Grab a meal and water. Rest in quick shifts, make last checks. We move out in 4 hours." Shaw dropped to the ground, pressing his body into the cool sand. He lifted one arm, waving in a silent signal for Anderson to move towards a greater cover. His night vision goggles revealed 2 militants carrying rifles, their silhouettes marching closer and closer. Shaw risked a quick glance at Anderson. Time seemed to slow as their eyes met, and they both nodded. In an instant, they sprung up in perfect synchronization, catching the militants by surprise. Firing a single round each from their suppressed M4, Shaw and Anderson advanced in the direction the men were coming from, stepping over the bodies as they moved. Moving quickly in a hunched-over pose, Anderson followed closely behind a Shaw as both men stepped to either side of a hut door. Silently, Anderson gave the doorknob a testing twist, checking to see if they locked the door. They didn't. He nodded to Shaw, who stepped in front of the door and raised his rifle before returning the nod. Anderson twisted the knob and pushed the door open in the same motion, allowing Shaw to step through and firing almost immediately, taking out a Somalian militant. Anderson was quick behind, and both men flowed through the small hut, clearing it of enemies before exiting out the back. The sounds of gunfire erupted in the distance as Shaw and Anderson continued deeper into the village, wading through ruins of falling buildings, tents, huts, and abandoned vehicles. A deafening crack of bullets blasted through the air, and Shaw whipped around. A truck careened towards them, its mounted gun spewing a hellish torrent of deadly lead in their direction. With lightning reflexes, he leapt into motion, dragging Anderson with him, throwing them both into the nearest cover as bullets whizzed by. Fear and adrenaline raced through his veins as he gritted his teeth and waited for the storm to pass. "They saw us," Anderson whispered behind the pile of sandbags, just before a mounted machine gun rattled, shooting in their direction. "Yeah," Shaw mumbled, looking around for cover options. "There! Go!" Both men were on their feet and scrambling. The mounted gunner saw them, and the heavy machine gun roared to life, spitting leaden death at the two Marines. Shaw leapt through the air, smashing through an ancient door with a flurry of splinters, and disappeared into a ruined building. The thunderous roar of the gunner followed them, bullets tearing chunks from the masonry walls as they ran, ducking and weaving desperately in search of cover, while the storm of lead rained down around them. Shaw lay flat below a blown-out window until the gunfire subsided. He caught Anderson's eye and made a series of quick hand gestures. Anderson nodded silently and crept to the splintered door, drawing his sidearm as he did. He leaned out the door and fired 3 quick, loud rounds before throwing himself back to the ground as the gunner again started his fusillade, Anderson's shots having drawn his attention. Shaw popped up from his crouch and sighted down the rifle, killing the gunner with a single precise shot to the head. He dropped his aim and fired 2 follow-up rounds into the chest of the driver, before both Marines got to their feet and continued through the village. Shaw and Anderson burst out into the street. The heavy gunfire had woken the rest of the militants as they filled the streets, running chaotically and shouting in Arabic. So far, no coordinated defense was coming from the enemy. Outnumbered, but better trained and equipped, the Marines capitalized on this confusion. "All teams, push in. Prosecute." Perez's heart skipped a beat as the first explosion rocked the cliffside, sending sheets of rock crumbling to the ground. He lay there motionless, his rifle pressing coldly against his shoulder as he peered through the scope's infrared lens, a menacing silence settling like a fog over the land. Perez simply muttered to himself, scanning. Then a second explosion rocked the night, throwing a bunch of screaming Somalian militants in the air before their charred bodies landed in the sand. Then another and another. The sound of automatic gunfire fired from AK rifles went off in the distance, punctuating the chilly night. Perez leapt from the ground, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he sprinted towards another section of the cliff. He pressed his body against the rock, aiming the rifle with a trembling hand as he peered into the scope. He saw an onslaught of figures, their AK-47s spitting fire and smoke like little dragons. Perez's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the right moment to strike. Then he found a Marine. Wasn't sure who it was, but he was under the infrared light, crouched behind cover, outnumbered by a handful of encroaching militants. Perez, shifting the rifle, looking through the scope. Firing the suppressed rifle, he saw the head of the man closest to the Marine snap backward before he fell to the ground. Catching the rest by surprise, the militants glanced around frantically, just as Perez fired again and again, calmly taking down one after the other before they had time to figure out what was happening. "Perez, do you copy?" Staff Sergeant Gabriel Shaw's voice ringing through the radio, the recurrent sound of gunfire puncturing his words. Perez pushed a button on his radio. "I copy. Go ahead." "I need a hand over here, on the left flank." Sergeant Eric Cruz speaking through the radio, his voice an erratic burst of distress and emergency. "King took a hit. Repeat, King has been hit. He's alive, but we're getting pushed back." "Perez, Move to the left flank. Provide cover to Cruz and King. Shaw's voice trailed off. We found them. We found them. 2 men and a little Somalian girl, Corporal Miller declared over the radio. I got it, Perez sighed, just before he jumped to his feet to race down the steep hill of sand, rock, and small bushes, fighting against gravity while keeping his feet steady. He ignored the aches in his joints that were becoming all too common as he reached a better angle to cover the left flank of the village. It had been about 30 minutes since the Marines infiltrated the village, finding the hostages. The air had gotten colder. The wind swept through the north. Gunfire echoed through the night as Shaw and his men launched their attack. The men of 7th Squad outmatched the militants. They had no chance of survival. Shaw's team moved in a well-choreographed line, clearing each room with precision and speed, ensuring no resistance. In minutes, they secured the area with none of Shaw's men suffering injury, though the same couldn't be said for their adversaries. The bullet that King took hit his body armor, but didn't penetrate. He would have massive bruising along his side for a week, but that was all. The village defenders had broken within minutes, either fleeing into the desert or throwing down their weapons in surrender. Most of the buildings were no longer standing. They riddled the walls with bullet holes. Some roofs had caved in. Shaw strode over to the 3 Somalian men on their knees, a few feet away from him. He looked down at the men with their hands flex-tied behind their backs, with their eyes on the ground in shame, as he strode past them toward his injured man. King sat with his armor off, breathing slowly and evenly. How is he? Shaw asked. What's your name? Shaw asked, as he approached the 2 journalists they rescued. Both men were sitting in the sand against the wall, looking around dumbstruck at the burning buildings and militia bodies. A Somalian girl sat beside them, clad in a long black hijab. She looked terrified and spoke no English. I'm Redman, James Redman, the man who spoke first in the video recording said. No, Mr. Redman, I know your name, Shaw said. What's your name? Shaw said to the second man, who looked just as lost as he was in the video. My friend seems to be in some state of shock, sir, James Redman said. My name is Bill Christensen, the second man said, just before he pointed to the young Somalian girl. This is Astor. They executed both of her parents right before her, said Bill Christensen. Please, we have to bring her with us, he added, meeting Shaw's eyes for the first time. The Chinook will arrive soon, Cruz said, glancing at his watch. Then he leaned closer to Shaw, who was standing over the freed hostages, with one hand on the butt of the rifle hung around his neck. You know we can't bring her with us, boss, Cruz whispered. There's enough space in the Chinook to house her, Shaw replied, staring down at the girl, who looked too nervous to keep eye contact with him. It's not about the space, you know that, Cruz insisted. Shaw looked down at the girl, then around at the village, and the vast expanse of desert beyond. What do you suggest we do, then? Shaw turned to Cruz, not minding if he was speaking loud enough for the junior Marines to hear. That we leave her here and let the terrorists find her again? She's local, Cruz said. Redmond said her village isn't far from here either. Do you think her village is going to take her back? You know what the culture is like out here. To them, she's damaged goods, Shaw said, spitting the words in disgust. She'll be exiled or sold. You okay with that? He asked, his gaze boring straight into Cruz. Cruz held his gaze and finally shrugged. It's your call, boss. Reinforcements are on their way here. We have to leave before they get here. Shaw said to the entire squad, as all men paid attention. Harris and Anderson, you take care of King. He glanced at his watch just before he turned to Cruz. Get those 3 ready to move, he said, nodding to the 2 reporters and the young girl.